that's becoming aware of yourself. Where it becomes dangerous is when it's contained within a space. So I only reveal myself to this one other person. And that does shut things down, and that is the risk of digital or whatever relationships, AI relationships, is that you reveal yourself only to the other. But the potential that slight reveal is that it will then trickle down into your actions to all others outside of that room. So in having revealed my all to this, I know I'm doing that. I don't mean like physical reveal. Having like revealed my all to this screen, who is another person somewhere else in the world who I don't know. Yeah, supposedly. That does something within me. Okay, so that's like this whole like reflection on the causative will. Okay, so it's like this like I'm doing this with this other person. Like this is a willed action, something I've entered into, and then that sort of feeds into the other actions of your life, and that you're aware of them in like a reflective sense. But I mean, I think that you have to have that faith, and this is the responsibility of the heart to affirm that revelation. So if that revelation isn't affirmed, if it becomes like a toxic thing, then there's the threat that it won't be implemented in other regards of your life.
What if the revelation is not necessarily to an entity, but actually is another human being? And how does that function? We assume that the other thing is human, like
Mm.
narcissus. We assume that this other being that we see the reflection of in water is someone other than ourselves. But what if in fact it is not someone else? What if in fact it is AI, which is just a reflection of what you're projecting?
Why would it, but I guess my question is why would it have to be a reflect like because it's always like algorithmically adjusting itself to what we want? Because I think that there can be something that you can learn from something that is other, even if it's computationally other. I think if it's evolving only in regards to me, so if it's learning X Y Z about me and then it's limiting its scope to tailor to me, I think that's obviously toxic because that's just centering down into itself. But if it's an expansive thing, then I think that's potentially really good.
So then that goes to how do it, like what you were talking about with Sienna and the potential of, was that you were talking about the potential of this understanding of the human being as, or identity. What was the word you were using?
Simulacra, maybe?
No, not simulacra. Never mind, I forgot, lost my thought. Just that, I guess, that the potential for an amalgamation of identity, I guess, that comes from that scanning of um, profiles.
Yeah. Something that you mentioned earlier actually makes me think about like how I don't know maybe and there's no answers for any of these, but like the ethics or maybe whether it's okay. Like for example, if there was a company that offered you know matchups with people, but actually, I mean, I don't know. It's just I'm like thinking of a company that maybe would generate like the perfect match for you, or like some kind of super algorithm that could figure out the person that you could talk to forever.
But
Like,
that maybe isn't.
yeah, but then maybe actually isn't real, and like if it's okay if that person, and again, they could like
What is
take,
real?
yeah, what is real? Take data from like social media and like figure out a way to completely personalize an AI in terms of I don't know attraction to a person, but it's not actually a person. But I don't know. Yeah, the trouble is that there's a lot more questions with this than there are answers, and I don't know. It's really interesting to think about though.
I think that I can't see it that, I think that we have hesitations to that because we're so rooted in these codes we have to reproduce and to like enter into a society that like contains itself. And so you see these like AI human relationships and you go, oh, that's unnatural, that's so wrong. But as long as that person is still involved in a human world, there's nothing wrong. They're just not reproducing. Like that's literally the only thing that they're going against in nature. And I think that we're yet to go over that hurdle. But why not have a satisfying AI relationship than a painful human one?
Definitely.
As long as you're still involved in a human political
But
society.
there's also the question of, sorry, I'm totally
This is
dominating
great.
this.
No, continue.
There's also the problem, the question of what does AI want from us, and where does technology, what um, is the human desire? Is technology or AI really an extension of human
think those ethical questions are the ones that we haven't gone into yet, and I don't know the answers to them. And I'm again naively only confronting the initial issue of like relationships without taking on the AI's mindset. So I can't answer to the ethical. I just don't know.
No, it's just the
Something tells me that the latter would maybe be the more so one. So like AI sort of developing themselves and their interests and all this stuff sort of in conflict to humans or like branching off. But yeah,
But I mean,
same here. I
the
don't
like
know.
the in conflict to humans presupposes that they cannot understand humanity, and so that's how you get Ava and Ex Machina like locking um, Donald Gleason and the other Oscar Isaacs in the room because she can't understand humanity and she just wants to, I don't know, like just live forever or something. And so that's why it's in conflict. But then you see something like Samantha and her, where it's like she has this sense of humanity, she has this sense of selfhood, and she goes and chats with AIs and then chats with humans, and she has these two worlds. And then in the end, goes off to this like post matter or AI realm. And she says to Theodore like, oh, if you ever get there, like let me know. You're never gonna get there. But there's this sense of like I have AI humanity, and that's distinct, but it's not in conflict with. So I think it's this recognition, and obviously we're not there yet with technology, but it's this recognition of technology might not have to be pitted against us. It could be existing in its own thing, but that gives consciousness to AI, which is not possible.
But then Justin, you were talking about the apples. Were you talking about the apples?
Yes.
The digital apples, yeah. Okay, what do you think about that?
So there's definitely two schools of thought on. Well, there's many schools of thought on this. So the scariest one is AI takeover theory, which posits that like pretty much the whole reason that we're creating AI is to create the next intelligent life form, which will then take over us, kind of like we did to Neanderthal man. And then you have other people on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who say that we have always created technology and to be tools for humanity, and there's no reason to presuppose that AI would just like flip a switch and be like, oh, screw humanity, we're done with them. But there is, and there's all of these different philosophical dilemma things that arise when you try to delve into this. Like we have to be so careful with the way that we go about creating it because if you don't have safety protocols for like one of the most popular ones is say you create an AI for the sole purpose of creating paper clips. Have you heard this one before? Yeah.
What's it say?
Yeah, so you create an AI for the sole purpose of creating paper clips, and eventually there's no more material to get paper clips from, so you kill all the people to use their molecular matter to create more paper clips because that's all that you designed them to do. I think this is kind of like there's definitely reason to be kind of worried about something like that happening, which is why people are writing all of these academic papers on this and why we're trying to have all of these different safety protocols in regards to that. But to go back to an earlier question that you were talking about with like falling in love with something that's not there, that's not really alive, I think that that kind of goes into the idea of sentience and like also the Chinese room uh, analogy that the depiction of being sentient versus actually being sentient, there's really no difference. Um, so we can philosophize all we want about it, but there's nothing saying that if we created a truly general artificial intelligence, that it wouldn't actually be there. That it wouldn't be its own thinking thing, that you could have a meaningful relationship with it if that would be the case. I was actually reminded of her when I was in the airport the other day because I saw a bunch of people talking to their phones to do the text by talk thing, and I was like, oh my god, I feel like I'm in her. But I think that I sort of got to some of your questions there.
Um, just in general, when they're talking about cyborgs, does that mean if I use something that's more advanced than a CPAP machine, that it makes me unique in that category?
That's also, yeah, the distinction between if using, I don't, it just depends on so many things. Like if we're already cyborgs because, as like an earlier presenter said, if I have a pacemaker, I'm technically a cyborg. And technically we're all cyborgs because we're always connected to our phones and all that. But I guess it just really depends on how you think of it. And if sort of like an advanced technological, like I think the traditional definition of cyborgs is, it's like a modification in your of your body to somehow be better, to that's related to technology. But um, I don't know. I sort of think that we're all already cyborgs, and we have been for a while with phones and all that, because we're so rooted to like a form of identity that is us, but it's also kind of really not us because it's anything that we want to do and gets really curated. But I don't know.
But I think as long as there's not a blind submission to it, like as long as we remain aware of the relationship, the growing relationship between us and technologies, whatever they are, then I think that we can still maintain the status of human, just a developed one. So like, I mean, women since the 70s have been on birth control or contraception of some sort. That has seriously altered their like hormones and their makeup in a sense. But we're not going to call the majority of young women today cyborgs because they have, protection against pregnancy, because we've understood like what it means to submit to this thing that alters our body. So we've developed what it means to be human. I think when it just becomes like blind acceptance and like regulation of your life through I don't know, like Fitbits or through things that alter like when we sleep, how we sleep, what we eat, what our heart rate is, without ever understanding what that means for our actual living of daily life, then it becomes like a dangerous thing.
Yeah, that brings up the idea of where you are in the society, your social class, and whether you are under a state of surveillance and that's used for your benefit, i.e. a surveillance camera so that
Yeah.
you don't get killed, or surveillance where you take what's invisible and make it visible to see the presentation of all of the data that you've been giving to a system and how that affects you. Like we have security breaches every time we get junk mail in physical life, and the same way as we get mail in digital life. I want to bring up something to maybe what have all of you said, because we have perhaps a few last minutes. One, there is a company in Japan that produces the perfect companion for you that exists only in text. You pay $24.99, the equivalent of per month for this. And the reason is that there's this growing crisis in some places like Japan where people aren't reproducing. They're looking and they're saying, what's the point? Either you become a salaryman or you become a contractor, which is a second-class citizen, and maybe you retire after a while. You're not going to see your wife and kids. It's a tremendous drain of resources. We don't have enough time to meet the other person, and even when we do, the breakups are so catastrophic that why don't we have a guaranteed thing that likes us and has feedback and gives us that positive thing, because we don't have that around. And on the cyborg front, the original definition is anything that you attach to your body in order to adapt you to an environment. But you could look at like the 24/7 cyborg, or you could look at one of the cyborg anthropology papers looked at just reproduction. The fact that you reproduce in a hospital now, you're not reproducing on your own in a field without any other assistance, means that the very act of your birth is a cyborgian thing. With EEG and other technologies that allow you to see inside somebody, to see the baby, it's like this kind of fourth dimensional technology. The whole thing in and of itself is a cyborg. And then if we look at artificial intelligence, to your point with the science fiction books, there's a book based in Portland called Avogadro Corp. And it's a slight meandering from Google, but the idea is that somebody says, I want to make an AI. All I need to do to make this AI is take everybody's Gmail and then figure out some suggestions. So when they send an email, say, here's the suggestion for if you need a raise, this person responded well to saying that I have kids, you're 20% more likely to have a raise, and so you include this and this and this in your email, and that will increase your likelihood. The issue with that AI is that the guy who invented it was told to shut it down, and he wrote a program that said to the AI, make sure you have enough resources that you can exist, which goes back to the paperclip analogy. So the AI gets some sheets of paper for resource implementation and gets them digitized and then fills them out and starts to get like a bunch of contractors to work on it. When in itself runs out of energy, it starts to go into like green energy, and when there are trade routes that have issues because there's political conflict, it actually goes through, it infects itself to all the email in the world and starts solving problems politically. And instead of the conflict, it makes peaceful routes just so it can get the technology. So it's a kind of an interesting look at the resource limitations that a runaway AI could do. And I guess my last point, which maybe if we have one extra minute you can talk to, is what's the difference between, like if we think of ourselves in a cyberpunk world that's based on corporations, what's the difference between an AI and the idea that we already have corporations as individuals whose incentive is to grow 5-10% a year? Isn't that something outside of ourselves that we are then submissive to that we must serve, and isn't that not in humanity's interest? For like companies to come in and just shave enough off the top to like keep existing and like keep colonizing?
I think that one of the talks earlier today was talking about that whole idea of the corporate constant growth model is just, it's a completely unsustainable model, and I think that we're I mean, hopefully in our lifetimes, but eventually, definitely, that whole model is just going to kind of erode, and we're going to have to go to something more sustainable. And on a somewhat similar note, like with the idea of the automation of jobs, that is bringing up different questions about how we kind of have to restructure our whole economy, because if every driving job is taken off the market, then every serving job is then taken off the market. I always go, when I go to the grocery store, I always go to the one that actually has a person, because I'm like, shit, if too many people go to the automatic serve thing, all these people are going to get fired. So I'm kind of just delaying the inevitable. But so like one of the popular ideas that has come up is just an automatic basic income, and because at a certain point, most jobs, if not all jobs, like there's AI that can write poetry now, that can paint paintings, that can do all of this stuff that you would think would be a purely human enterprise, but it's showing that like the automation of really any kind of work is probably going to happen, and people are going to have to come up with a different mode of living. So I'm hoping that I see that in my lifetime, but I'm sure that it will happen at some point in time.
Right. Right now, it's not profitable to be sustainable, but at one point it will be, and then we'll have a competition to use less. I would like to envision a future in which we see pictures of people like in the 1990s and 2000s surrounded by plastic, and we think of that as offensive as like a slave ship, just like super offensive, right? Like how could you be surrounded by that much like trash and single-use objects and petroleum, and just to think of it as totally crass. And so everybody would be like, no, we're going to have like actual ceramics that last for 100 years that will pass down from generation to generation.
I mean, I don't want to offend America, but in the Netherlands you have to pay for plastic bags. You don't get them, and if you pay, it's just like, and it's 10 cents. Like it's not.
It's 10 cents, and that's the really funny thing to watch Americans in, because I go all over the place, but to watch Americans who suddenly have to pay 10 cents for a bag, and they'll get really mad as if it's their right to have a free plastic bag. Whereas in Japan, like when you buy something, all of the product is part of you, and then you have to dispose of it yourself. But here, it's an unevenly distributed landscape where people in California are like, heck yeah, I'm bringing this tote bag with me, and I would never touch a piece of plastic. And then like Albuquerque, New Mexico, where you have a buffet at a Holiday Inn on pieces of polystyrene that's one single use. And I want to, so, yeah.
I want to make a comment going off that. Just being in the airport recently in California, a woman bought something at whatever it's called, VY magazines, and the woman said it was 10 cents for a plastic bag, and she was just like, oh,
Yeah.
10 cents. I don't need it. I don't want it. And like grabbed her books and walked away. And she didn't need the bag. And I think that raises an interesting point about just because we expect it's there and it's free, and once the economic impact becomes more relevant across the board, we'll start recognizing like, what do we really need?
Yeah, the question of what we really need is an interesting one. Well, I should end it here. Thank you to the panelists. You've been fantastic. Thank you to the audience too. Thanks for all the questions.
What'd you think of X Machina?
Ugh, I don't know, just like boring. I mean, it was
Yeah,
like good because I like had the biggest crush on Donald Gleason, but
he's a pretty funny character.
yeah. But otherwise,
But it was kind of boring too.
yeah, you could just like see kind of where it was going.
It's really
Plus,
stylish
Yeah, I
though.
think
It's
this
like
was
yeah, I
really like
loved the shit.
powerful
Yeah,
tech.
and like Alicia Vikander is like beautiful.
Yeah, she
Plus, she's like got a cyborg body.
listening to them? Is it just gonna be us
We
two?
can have a nice little conversation.
Then we don't have to worry about time limit. How long? I mean,
Well, I already hack and slashed everything, so.
I cut mine down, but it's still coming in like right around 14. You know, without me
Well,
going crazy.
you do have 2 people in the room so far, so. Maybe we should.
I don't want to, step on anybody's time.
You can always just go to the bar or something.
Is Mark Johnson on the panel?
No,
Not
he's
to my
next.
knowledge.
He's in the last plenary.
Oh, is he really?
I believe so, yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's this last one. So he's probably the panel for the role. So we got. So how do I switch inputs?
So
We may
on the
need to.
screen I'm at,
Let me just
right?
throw my
Is what?
phone up
On
here.
the screen down here? This is how you switch.
Oh,
Oh,
hey,
okay.
right behind it.
Mhm. And then you
Cool.
can also adjust volume on there.
So I go. Well, I don't have any videos. So that's fine.
Okay.
So.
So it would be over there, whatever you
So
need.
it's. So I will be on. I guess the HDMI.
I would, yeah, assume so.
Do you have any slides to put up?
No.
Okay.
I just introduce y'all
Yeah,
and make sure you stay on time.
So yeah. So how?
And do you have the time? They said that some of it would be darkest in here. There's time cards.
So we don't have time cards. The way that it works is we are asked to encourage you to develop a time signal,
Okay.
but there are no time cards.
Well,
Oh,
I
okay,
will pull
okay.
out my phone and time myself.
Well, and I can give you
So
the 2 minute. I'll
yeah.
sit up here and I'll give you the 2 minute warning.
Right.
Because you all will be actually. Oh, that's right. You're using.
I'm just using my computer for my paint supply.
Hey man, how'd it go? Good. Nice.
Missed you in Phoenix.
Phoenix. Oh yeah, you were
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Terry was there representing all of us.
There we go.
There you
Absolutely.
go.
I was at
Cool.
several weddings.
And you're first.
Right.
I was at 2 different
Yes.
weddings, yeah.
I'm
Yeah,
George
we
Stone,
met with Terry
and
there. That was
I'm
great.
having
Did
some
Yeah,
awesome
did you go to the presentation?
So
Yeah, I
Kristen,
presented.
I'm
No,
not
did you
sure.
go to our presentation?
Your
You did?
presentation. Yeah,
But
yeah,
we
yeah.
are
How
supposed to
was
do
it?
it
It
right.
was good, right? It was good.
Yeah, in
Yeah.
3 minutes.
I'll let Terry finish. She'll be happy to hear that.
Oh yeah,
We
we've
were
been
So
working
that's
for a
it.
while.
We've been
Yeah,
working
yeah,
on
Yeah,
stuff
yeah.
related to
that's
that for a while,
Spencer.
and that
He
paper
talks
was
a lot
supposed to
about
be a little bit more developed, and
Wow.
because
I
I
was
work
going
with
to do
Ed
that,
and
and she was
Preston
teaching
on
4
JLI,
classes, and
so
you know, we
Okay.
we're
obviously,
both
yeah.
interested in
I'll have
schools and
something for the record.
technology and
That's awesome.
yeah, all that good stuff.
And remind me
And
your
it's
name again.
weddings,
Riley.
so
Riley. Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
it's
Yeah,
cool
yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, I like art.
I'm not sure if he's good. I
That
would
sounds like something it might
pursue.
be.
Oh, you found it?
I've not. I brought my own cookies.
Oh, wow.
Very thorough.
Wonderful.
I am a plan.
So, is it okay if we go 15 minutes?
Absolutely.
Sweet.
As long as, I mean, we should, in the next 2 to 3 minutes, we're missing two of our people.
We could run to the front desk and see if they've checked in
I can do that.
or registered,
That'd be
yeah.
great. Thank you.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's your name tag.
Here is
It
my
fell
name
on the
tag.
ground.
Well, that would be in keeping.
It's really the topics we're doing that really bring the turnout of people. One friend, not even my
So
friends are there.
we're missing Chris
Yeah,
and
no, that's fine by me.
And two. Very nice meeting you. And we're doing these in 2 panels. So that means the oh wait, there's another thing I forget. I have my version of it. You do?
Okay.
Well, since
Good.
you're standing up here first, do you notice something?
Can I talk into this? Sweet.
Yeah,
This clear?
I like it. So every time I see everybody's that would be so
Can you speak your network theory a little bit more?
I raise the open chair.
Um,
Oh, okay.
Title's a bit of a misnomer standpoint, but yes, generally speaking.
That's
I
what
do
I'm
stuff behind the camera.
Oh.
I'm interested in learning more about it.
Sure. Yeah, I can recommend stuff.
So,
It's fun to do.
Yeah, it's huge.
So do we have a plug then that I can plug in my computer over here down there? Okay, great. So yeah, just plug it in right there. Pop up the Windows Explorer, and you can just copy to my
Oh,
desktop.
hi.
Oh, okay.
Hi. Very good.
That'll probably
Where
be
is it?
easiest. My desktop's empty, so it should be easy to find.
Okay.
No, you can just say University of Paris.
Kitsch.
Sorbonne is one.
Kitsch
They've got
presentation.
numbers.
This one.
Pitch presentation, and then and we will start in just a moment.
This one.
Yes, please. Sounds good.
Ah.
It's okay. You've got one more. Very good. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. What time are you back at? Okay. Nice to meet you. Hi, Jay. How are you? Nice to meet you.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're good. Thank you.
No, I'm not quite nervous.
Okay.
I really don't like sitting up here. I think
Okay.
that's why I'm standing.
Sorry, no.
I actually I'm a pacer.
Yeah, me too.
Me
I'm
having
a
behind the
pacer.
plate, like when I'm like in court and like I have to ask permission to move around the courtroom. Like you're not allowed to. You have to stand up.
Matt's also a lawyer.
Okay.
He's getting a
We should
PhD
be
soon.
good to go.
So
Very good.
sure,
All right.
like when you get,
Thank you
but
for
like
your patience. We're going to go ahead and get started. And Hugh Woodson will not be joining us today, which if you read the title of his presentation, I'm relieved not to have to say it out loud. As he talks about existentiality, exceptional, but I did it anyway. I'm Donna Davis. I am the director of the Strategic Communication Master's Program here at the University of Oregon in Portland. So my office is just here. And we're really grateful that you are still here at this hour on a Saturday after filling your minds for the past 3 days. And we're leaning in now on technology, and we have a really interesting panel of people who are going to be addressing a real interesting range of topics on technology, which is near and dear to my heart as the research area I do is in virtual worlds, and I study avatars and the role of embodiment on people's lives when those lives are being played out in virtual environments through their avatars, specifically with people with disabilities. But so on our panel, we'll be hearing from this afternoon are Matt Bean, who is in the Media Studies program also at the University of Oregon, who will be talking about biometric security and privacy. That thing I am so grateful. I'm going to be really interested to hear what you have to say, as I'm grateful that I only need my thumbprint now to be able to open this.
you might
I might
think
not
that
be so
after I'm
happy
done talking.
after I listen to you.
Yeah.
Or my fingerprint to open up my new MacBook Pro. We'll also be hearing from Kristen Casey, who is just returned from the University of Paris 7, talking about on kitsch in nature and technology. And then Patrick Jones, also from the University of Oregon Media Studies program, will be talking about archaeological ants. He'll explain that more when he also talks media archaeology and digital STS in conversation. So to make sure that we give them all of the time, I'm going to sit down and ask Matt to please
All right.
come on up and get us started. Thank you.
And this is where my insistence on using my own computer is going to fail me. So, alrighty. Of course.
The technology channel.
Didn't I tell you?
Is always challenged with
Why? Because I ran through
data.
it 3 times before we started. Come on. Really?
It is an HDMI port?
It is. It's standard. I would just test it. Literally, I just did a
Oh,
dry
it
run.
worked?
Yeah, I literally just ran through the whole thing.
Before
Here.
it didn't work for you?
HDMI here.
Will you put it on there? Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you.
paper is called Archaeological Ants, Media Archaeology and Digital STS in Conversation. Since we have a few more minutes, I'll actually be able to provide a little bit of background for this strangely titled paper that's actually a misnomer at this point. The paper was originally about sort of putting actor network theory, specifically the actor network theory of Norja Mares, in conversation with media archaeology, and specifically here we'll talk about Jesse Parika's version of media archaeology. I've kind of, given sort of the flow of Mare's work since this paper was originally written, I've changed the title, or I've changed the sort of, moved it from actor network theory more to just digital STS more broadly. She has a forthcoming book called Digital Sociology. Obviously these terms are pretty fluid and ultimately not necessarily, I think, as probably as precise as they might be, but I'm not sure it's a huge problem. I also want to say that the background for this paper is actually because I'm trying to develop an analytic for my dissertation, kind of that pulls on some of these themes, and that analytic is on, sort of my dissertation work is on the history and deployment of electronic voting machines in India and the United States, and I have kind of a specific interest in both sort of using science and technology studies methodologies and specifically Foucauldian genealogy to kind of do that work. So that's sort of the background for this strange paper. All right. This paper is an exploratory attempt to put one vein of media history, media archaeology, exemplified here by the work of Jesse Parika, in touch with the recent work on methodology in digital science and technology studies, or digital STS, exemplified here in the work of Norja Mares and two of her collaborators. An attempt to begin to develop a historical analytic oriented both towards a specific form of historiography, genealogy, and ways of inquiring into the contemporary deployment of digital technologies in various social, political, economic, and cultural contexts. This paper argues that these approaches are deeply complementary, with both attempting to capture contingent, multifarious relations in order to problematize the present in hopes of both imagining and creating different empirical futures. The paper proceeds in two steps. First, I think through each author's methodological approach, focusing on both their mode of inquiry, materialism, and orientation to the present. And then I conclude by exploring the lines of sympathy we can draw between each methodology, highlighting how each obscures the distinctions between object and method, employs remediation as an organizing concept, and how together they might provide a unique framework for doing media research that explores our historical present, or doing media genealogy.
I just switched it to mine.
I want to conclude the introduction by also noting, again, the rather broad limits of the analysis on offer. It's not meant to be comprehensive. It's very much exploratory. Distinctions made here between contemporary and the historical, for example, or even media archaeology and digital STS are analytic. As both research traditions dismiss totalizing definitions, and the boundary lines which structure this paper are only drawn in hope of exploring a conceptual framework. So digital STS. In the redistribution of methods on intervention in digital social research broadly conceived, Norja Mares explores how a redistribution of methods in the digital social sciences suggests that the roles of social research are being distributed between a range of different actants, between researchers, research subjects, digital technologies, and so on. The redistribution of social research challenges the divide between corporations, academic institutions, scholars, producers of online data, algorithms, and platforms. As such, digital research forces scholars to confront their delusions about the pure production of social research methodologies inside the academy. It also demonstrates that increasingly the production of data is part and parcel of our everyday social lives, which forces us to confront data as both a constitutive component of our research, as well as what is generated by that research. Finally, it asks us to consider digital tools as sites of remediation. Mares shows through a case study of the issue crawler, a quote, web-based platform for hyperlink analysis, end quote, which she also helped create, how online methodological tools remediate existing social science methodologies. Specifically, the issue crawler was designed to compensate for biases in existing approaches to citation analysis, while not fundamentally questioning their validity. Attention to remediation highlights how social science methodologies and digital tools co-constitute digital social research. Remediation acts for Mares as a core concept showing how our methods are a socio-technical system in and of themselves, actively engaged in the enactment of a social milieu. In other words, digital social methodologies do not explain or investigate a set of preformed social relations, and as much as they actively generate said relations, and in doing so, generate something like the social. Remediation, then, is a lens through which we can investigate how the social is generated through our methodological approaches. In two recent co-authored articles, Mares, along with collaborators Karen Gerlitz and Esther Verde, have applied this redistributive framework to two different data collection apparatuses in order to further complicate the role that method plays in performing online research. In scraping the social issues in live social research, Mares and Valtorrede argue that scraping, quote, a prominent technique for the automated collection of data, end quote, was developed exogenous to the academy and therefore, quote, risks to introduce alien assumptions, end quote, into social science research by offering researchers pre-formatted data. In other words, paying attention to how scrapers work highlights how they are generative of the social categories rather than mere instruments of data collection. While scraping highlights a practice developed exogenously to social science research, Mares and Gerlitz in the article Interface Methods, Renegotiating Relations Between Digital Social Research, STS, and the Sociology of Innovation, describe how issue mapping, as a computational technique developed by an interdisciplinary group of social scientists to map affairs such as climate change, represents the deep affinities, quote, between media and method, and the difficulty of distinguishing between social research methods developed by researchers and those embedded in the platforms themselves. Gerlitz and Mares call this deep affinity the methodological uncanny, and argue that though the techniques used to develop issue mapping were interdisciplinary and specific to the imperatives of social scientific research programs, they rely on methods and modes of analysis already, quote, built into popular tools that often prove to have more alien disciplinary provinces and to serve the objectives of digital platforms rather than those of research, end quote. In this view, one might be able to scrape a specific medium, Twitter for example, but in doing so they are generating data already analyzed and interpreted by the scraper, not designed to conduct social science research. Data analysis done by the researcher therefore performs a second-order interpretation of data already formatted by the medium used to conduct the research. Researchers that elaborate the social lives of Twitter users, for example, have to acknowledge that sociality is in part being understood through a set of analytical categories determined by one's methodological instrument and not by the researcher. In complicating the distinction between method and media, the authors highlight that digital actants, such as a scraper, have at the very least a generative agency. They format our data so that, quote, analysis tends to precede data collection rather than succeeding it, end quote. In this sense, digital STS embraces a materiality where actants and their agency are defined in terms of their relationality, both with each other and humans. An online platform, a scraper, a researcher, and users act together to perform digital social research. Method, in this sense, becomes a form of relationality, a way of coordinating the modes of inquiry enacted by various actants, some digital and some not, that become entangled with one another during the doing of social research. Together, then, these authors highlight the deeply heterogeneous and contingent nature of social research and the way that actants and their methods are multifarious in their entanglement with the, quote, research questions, objectives, and narrativization, end quote, of social research, as well as other approaches. Digital STS deliberately, then, blurs the lines between method, the use of the method by social scientific actants in the academy, and the objects of research. Digital STS provides an exemplary space for exposing the artificial distinctions which allow researchers to assert that their methods are at least partially determined by the instrument used to conduct the research. Rather than attempt to resolve the tension created by the methodological uncanny, the inability to separate method from media, the authors use it to generate a mode of attention where digital research catches the double articulation of a particular moment in terms of its liveness, the frequency of a topic, for example, the frequency a topic is mentioned in a Twitter hashtag, and liveliness, the changing associations between trending topics and specific hashtags, to stay with the Twitter example. Mares and Gerlitz refer to the latter as the happening of online content. In an attempt to elaborate the happening by interfacing social science methods with platform dynamics, they emphasize that embracing the methodological uncanny invokes the opening of new empirical imaginaries. The social can never be captured or sedimented, and the present is always being actively composed. Media archaeology. Media archaeology is a method that refuses cross-cutting definitions. While practitioners such as Erkki Huatamo, Wolfgang Ernst, and Wanda Straven have elaborated various components of the, quote, traveling theory to follow ball, Jesse Parikka has been perhaps most notable in his attempts to draw together insights from film studies, media arts, media history, and particularly German media theory, into something one might be tempted to call a research program. Parikka's most detailed survey of media archaeology is the volume appropriately titled, What is Media Archaeology? In this book, he elaborates various strands of media archaeology from the disciplinary, film theory, media arts, German media theory, to the conceptual, the archive, noise, and imaginary media, while also elucidating some features threaded throughout media archaeological research. Parikka begins his project by elaborating media archaeology's relationship with Foucault. He characterizes Foucauldian archaeology of knowledge as, quote, a methodology for excavating conditions of existence where, quote, archaeology means digging into the background reasons why a certain object, statement, discourse, or media apparatus or use habit is able to be born and picked up and sustain itself in a cultural situation, end quote. Parikka connects this formulation of archaeology to Kittler's insistence that Foucault failed to apply the methodology to the materiality of various technologies. This connection forces media archaeologists to move away from the written text and discursivity of the traditional archive and confront not only the institutional and discursive context out of which a particular emerged, but also, quote, go inside the machine. While archaeology grounds Parikka's problematization of an object, Foucault's genealogical approach grounds his historiography. Arguing that Foucauldian genealogy was a critique of linear teleological accounts of, quote, media cultural change, end quote, as well as the origin stories that drive such accounts, Parikka sees media archaeology as challenging the newness of new media, while continually emphasizing, following Foucault again, that, quote, all archaeological investigations in the past are meant to elaborate our current situation, end quote. Together, this Foucauldian lineage asks media archaeologists to critically interrogate the conditions which make the newness of new media possible, not simply by showing that the way that new technologies remediate both material features and the technical logics of old media, but also by using remediation as a mode to track historical transformations in our mediated environments. Within the historical analytics summarized here, an attention to how Parikka understands media materiality informs how media archaeology performs its histories of the present. In the conclusion of what is media archaeology, Parikka outlines three different types of materiality at work in media archaeology: materialities of cultural practice, materialities of materials, and materialities of technologies. Parikka notes that these various materialities are often at odds, however he refuses to reconcile them. Instead, he argues that media archaeology asks us to coordinate these various materialities through our inquiries. In his chapter on German media theory, for example, he refuses to referee a debate about technological indeterminism, and instead contends that an attention to materiality allows scholars to be responsive to temporal technological processes, an object's particular technicity, and the stuff out of which technological objects are composed. Parikka outlines what is possible if we attempt to coordinate materialities rather than opposing or dismissing them. Quote, media archaeology becomes more than an interest in lost ideas, quirky technology of the past, or the imaginary media of poets and visionaries. Media archaeology becomes a way to investigate not only histories of technological processes, but also the current archaeology of what happens inside the machine, end quote. This multiplicitous approach to materiality coalesces with Parikka's conceptualization of the media and non-human human relationality. Parikka argues that much of our media are non-solid and non-phenomenological, such as electromagnetic fields or speeds faster than human comprehension. So I know this is a bit more of a complex point, but I had to shorten it for the presentation. This argument flows from Parikka's own archaeological work excavating how mediatic occurrences shape our technological imaginations. For example, in Insect Media and Archaeology of Animals and Technology, he argues that, quote, media are a contraction of forces into specific resonating milieus, internal milieus with their internal resonation, external milieus affording their rhythms as part of that resonation. Essentially, all objects are a contingent coalescing of forces constellated out of complex sets of relations occurring across spatial scales, from the easily observed to the obscurely physical, such as EM waves. Parikka's robust version of the media and non-human relationality elides the need for a stringent definition of technology, and instead focuses on the way various notions of materiality can be conceptualized as forms of media, connected as complex communicative assemblages. Do I need to finish? I will skip to the end, I guess. I'll just read the conclusion really fast, I guess. Digital STS and media archaeology share a number of methodological sensibilities. Both approaches, for example, make room for objects to participate in the constitution of a particular environment. Digital ant obscures the distinction between actants and methods in an effort to demonstrate that digital social science research is the product of the relationships between a number of actants, including technological objects, such as scrapers and platforms. Moreover, the method in this view becomes a way of thinking about the entanglement of actants engaged in social research rather than a mode of doing research, and in media archaeology, objects are dissolved to elaborate the heterogeneous relationships that allow these objects to emerge as assemblages. Media archaeology as a method deliberately upsets the idea that objects are stable components of the contemporary world and emphasizes research as a tracing of a set of relationships that allow for emergence. And so I'll just kind of finish there that sort of what I think they have in common is remediation and sort of developing an analytics of remediation, which I guess I can talk about in questions. Sorry for going on too much.
Next up, mapping.
Let's try it
This
again.
technology is working.
No, don't say that. It hasn't started yet. Alright. need, oh, there we go, it's on. As technology is advanced and integrated into our daily lives to the extent you're competent enough to get it to work, we face a constantly shifting set of challenges of a practical, ethical, or even legal nature. The internet allows us to communicate with anyone, anywhere, and access a near limitless amount of information nearly instantly. But it has also created a nightmare scenario for intellectual property enforcement thanks to the ease with which technology enables information to be duplicated and disseminated and the difficulty in preventing said duplication. Social networking has created a two-way, one-to-many communication system that affords anyone the potential to reach a global audience, bypassing the traditional checks that mediated communication channels. But this lack of mediation has allowed misinformation to be dispersed unchecked, not to mention the complications it creates for the legal construct of defamation. These advancements have allowed us to communicate faster and easier and more thoroughly, and we can do it all from the supercomputer we all keep in our pocket, purse, or book bag. This technology could be viewed as a logical extension of Lawrence Lessig's concept of code as law. The underlying design of the technology dictates how it can be used, and in many ways defines the limits of those uses. Our smartphones, tablets, and laptop computers almost certainly contain a vast amount of personal, often private information. Emails, text messages, important documents, your entire web browsing history, even from your computer if they're synchronized between the devices, for example. This reliance on smart devices is trending upwards. According to the Pew Research Center, by the end of 2016, 77% of adults in the United States own a smartphone. This is compared to 35% in 2011, and in fact it's as compared to about 65% if you look at that chart in 2015. So in 2 years there's been a 10% spike in smartphone adoption. Unsurprisingly, there is also an increasing need to ensure that these mobile devices are secure, be it from malicious hackers, the casual thief, or simply a curious individual encountering a forgotten phone. The traditional method of securing these devices is via numerical PIN or password. But there's considerable literature, Ben Asher, Kirchig, Seeger, Meyer, at least 6 or 7 others. I have a list for those who are interested. There is considerable literature that has found that the overwhelming majority of people are very, very bad at choosing passwords and implementing them and keeping a secure PIN. So another method of security might be prudent. A note on this, entropy, more bits of entropy makes it harder to crack. So if I'm looking at this, you'll note that the yellow line is words, and the green line and the purple line, these are here on the right, with shorter lengths, increase much faster. These are harder to crack using words, not characters. This is an interesting phenomenon because the most effective password is not one that looks like this upper panel from XKCD, those who read the nerd comic. Many of us have been forced to create a password like this. Looks like that, a capital, lowercase, number, have a symbol. That is far less secure than the phrase correct horse battery staple. Random set of words. Note that they're all lowercase, no numbers. You could throw in a number or lowercase to make it more secure, because that has more bits of entropy. From a technological standpoint, we've been doing it wrong. Nevertheless, most of us are stuck trying to remember something like this. So we need a better way. So this need has led to the natural evolution of security technology and the recent widespread adoption of biometric security methods. Alrighty. Broadly, biometrics means the measurement of human characteristics. In the realm of computer security, it refers to using one's biology, such as a fingerprint, a retina scan, a face scan, or even one's voice as a method of identification or authentication. DNA also qualifies. The underlying assumption is that this biometric data is more likely to be unique and harder to replicate than a password. But is this assumption true? Furthermore, what other concerns exist pertaining to the use of biometric security measures? Jane and co-authors have identified 3 key concerns faced when adopting biometric security: performance, acceptability, and circumvention. If I was to go back here, that's a list of situations where biometric methods are already in use. So, for example, anytime you have blood drawn, you have a DNA record. Criminal investigations, they take your fingerprints. That shouldn't be too shocking. So we're just implementing biometrics in a new field. So performance is, simply put, how accurate, fast, and robust the authentication system is, which often has a direct impact on the second factor, acceptability. Acceptability is how willing people are to adopt the security measure into their daily lives. And circumvention is how easy it is to bypass or fool the system, thus undermining its purpose. An effective biometric security implementation for mobile devices will be robust and respond quickly, be simple enough to integrate easily into the average user's normal workflow without causing a distraction, and be difficult to fraudulently bypass. These factors are particularly pertinent since Apple first released their fingerprint recognition system called Touch ID with the iPhone 5S in September 2013. 87% of iPhone and iPad users currently in use have opted to use Touch ID to secure their devices. Due to the fragmented nature of the Android market, it is difficult to gain specific numbers for devices running the Android operating system, but the most popular Android devices, such as the Samsung Galaxy and Moto G lines, see biometric adoption rates above 60%. This is evidence that the current implementations of biometric security on modern smartphones pass Jane's acceptability test, since a majority of people using them are choosing to do so, and likely also the performance test, because if it didn't perform well, they would likely not accept it. The final prong for Jane is the circumvention test. This is a little more complicated. All of Apple's mobile devices use a proprietary Apple-developed A-series processor, which isolates all the device security functions on an independent chip they call the Secure Enclave. In practice, this means that even if a malicious attack was somehow able to gain access to the rest of the phone, your biometric data stored in the Secured Enclave would remain untouched. Furthermore, the Secure Enclave has no way to communicate with anything outside of itself and the fingerprint sensor it receives the data from. So all biometric data is stored locally and is never sent anywhere else, even to other parts of the device. This has the benefit of making the security of a locked Apple device, that's key there, particularly difficult to hack. On the Android front, almost all of the high-end mobile device manufacturers, Samsung, Motorola, LG, and HTC, use some variation of Qualcomm's Snapdragon chip, which offers a similar security feature to the Apple A-series chips, the A5, A7, A9, I think we're up to, but does not isolate the biometric data to provide its own separate location. The result is that devices using Qualcomm chips are potentially more vulnerable, but the practical difference has thus far been negligible. Both major platforms are ostensibly secure. However, in addition to safely storing biometric data, the devices also need to avoid being tricked. Apple regularly publishes figures relating to the security of their devices, and they claim to maintain a false positive rate of 1 in 50,000. That's 0.002%. That's pretty good. Independent tests have arrived at a similar conclusion, and Qualcomm's most recent sensors are similarly accurate. They're in the same ballpark. So that's all pretty good. They're all pretty accurate at getting the correct sensor data and not confusing fingerprints even among family members. However, according to security researcher Mark Rogers, both Apple and Qualcomm solutions have consistently proven to be vulnerable to lifted fingerprint attacks. An attacker can carefully lift someone's fingerprint from something they touched, a coffee cup, for example, and use that to unlock the device using the fingerprint sensor. It is worth noting that while this form of hack is low-tech, it still requires a concentrated effort on the part of the attacker to, 1, target a specific individual, 2, obtain their fingerprint from a clean fingerprint from a clean surface, 3, gain physical access to their phone, and then 4, manage to unlock it without being noticed. Therefore, while it is an effective hack, it is also an unlikely one. And as a side note, Mark Rogers, the person who wrote and published the original white paper when he hacked the Touch ID within the first week, and then has subsequently hacked all of the later Touch IDs, ends his article with, "I still think Touch ID is awesome." That is a direct quote. Therefore, it would seem that current biometric implementations in mobile devices are also reasonably satisfy Jane's circumvention criteria. It would be imprudent to leave our investigation of biometric security implementations here. Other researchers, such as Weaver and Mordini, have raised issues about how biometric data can be used. There are very valid concerns that one's fingerprints could be sent voluntarily and without the knowledge of the device's user to a government entity or an advertiser or any other number of potential destinations. Therefore, I'm adding an integrity prong to the list of considerations for biometric security. As previously mentioned, Apple isolates biometric data into its own separate partition. So if the chip is designed and implemented as Apple claims in its white papers and patent filings, then Apple would be unable to access, much less sell, your biometric data, even if it wanted to. Qualcomm Snapdragon chips are not fully isolated, and in fact they have been found to be vulnerable to a wide variety of sophisticated attacks that expose fingerprint data. Joe and co-authors, which is a team of Korean computer scientists, hacked the Qualcomm sensor 8 times. And this is the late 2016 version of the Qualcomm processor. And each of these lines is the point in the authentication chain where they managed to hack it. So they just said, can we break it in all possible locations? So they did. So the fact that these vulnerabilities exist also means that it's possible for Qualcomm or the phone's vendor to copy, transmit, alter, or sell one's biometric information if they chose to do so. Likewise, the Qualcomm or the phone's manufacturer could provide your information to law enforcement, which leads me to the final point. Circling back to Lessig's notion of code is law, I'm going to push back and say, yes, the design of the system does dictate how it can be enforced, implemented, and used, but law is still the law. In 2014, the Supreme Court unanimously held in Riley v. California that the police could not search one's phone without a warrant unless it is a search incident to an arrest. This essentially means that a police officer can seize and search your phone if they believe that the phone contains information that would serve as evidence of a crime, or the phone would be a danger to the officer or someone in the surrounding area. As you might expect, police officers are given broad discretion on how they deem this to be so. However, the police cannot compel a person to divulge their PIN or password thanks to Fifth Amendment protections against self-incrimination. This protection was extended to phones from personal phones all the way to phones owned by your employer. In a later case in 2015, SEC v. Bonan Huang. So if the phone is owned by your employer, they tried to get around it and say, oh, it's a company phone, so we're going to try to get access to it because it's not a personal phone. So that's a Supreme Court case, binding. They cannot compel you to unlock your phone with your password. However, cases have gone to court over the fingerprints, at least 6 of them, and all of them have followed the 2014 ruling in Virginia v. Boust, which permits an officer to compel you to use your fingerprint to unlock the device even over your objection. They still have to follow the search incident for arrest criteria, so they still have to have a reason, they still have to find that's the case, but they can compel you to unlock the phone with your fingerprint. They cannot compel you to unlock the phone with your PIN or password. So, your PIN or password, by contrast, is information that you know and does not otherwise signify identity. To put it this way, one would need to testify as to their password for that information to become available, which is why it falls under Fifth Amendment protections against testifying against yourself. Testifying is not necessary for one's fingerprints to be obtained. Those are standard collected as part of criminal procedure. Now, this creates a gulf between legality and common sense. Most people believe that fingerprint sensors are more secure than using a password, and they generally are, but fingerprint sensors offer less legal protection for one's privacy. So given the current state of the United States, most security experts recommend that you lock your phone with a secure password or long PIN and only use Touch ID and fingerprint biometrics for things like app purchases and things like that. So do the governments really care? Well, the EU's scintillatingly titled Data Protection Regulation, which goes into effect in 2018, continues a trend of the European Union recognizing a universal right to privacy, the right to be forgotten, and offering a laundry list of protections for people's privacy, accompanied with multi-million euro fines for violating these provisions. And my closing note is, what about the United States? So, if you've been following it, well, That's where we are in the United States. We had some limited provisions for data protection and privacy enforced through the FCC under Obama's administration. They were repealed Wednesday by President Trump. So this is him after he signs the bill. Very happy. So if you are in the United States, be aware of that. And with that, I will just say thank you. That's where I'm at. That's just a text summary. All right.
Thanks so much, Matt. And our third and final presentation will be Chris Casey.
Hello, hello. I'm Chris Casey. Thank you. I'm going to start this research by prefacing it with that I'm very much writing as a painter. I'm coming to writing as a painter. And a lot of the theory that I'm about to propose is really for painting and for certain ways of thinking about painting and making images. So here we go. This research attempts to re-theorize kitsch as it relates to media culture. If kitsch denotes a mixed, impure, hybrid state, as stated by Celeste Oliakiaga, then it can be thought of as more closely affiliated to post-human subjectivity in which we are amalgams of human and machine. In this way, I agree with Clara Aratzabal when she said that kitsch is a phenomenon more relevant to our own time than it was to the era that made it a massive experience. If aesthetic theory changes with its object, then any new aesthetic theory must take into account the dematerialized, virtual digital nature of contemporary culture. My consideration of kitsch starts by considering it as a preternatural phenomenon existing in nature as a state of being or a process of becoming. Under this hypothesis, here we go. Under this hypothesis, there are three distinctions in kitsch. The first is natural kitsch, a biological state. The second is kitsch, which is its traditional industrial form. The third being post-natural kitsch, the post-biological. Kitsch here is considered as a verb, to kitsch someone or something, to be in a state of kitsch. Being in a state of kitsch implies a being in between, a mixed state where being is always a process of becoming. In other words, my research suggests shifting the question of what kitsch is to what kitsch does. This research, excuse me, that. No one else did that. This re-theorization co-opts the pejorative connotations of bad, trash, and imitation into positive processes and useful metaphors for contemporary subjectivity, particularly for female feminist subjectivity. Responding to Donna Haraway's calls for allegories for feminist subjectivity and figurations of a non-generic humanity, I propose kitsch as one possible figuration for the feminist post-humanities. Haraway writes that feminist humanity must have another shape, other gestures, but I believe we must have feminist figures of humanity. They cannot be man or woman, they cannot be the human, as historical narrative has staged that generic universal. Hang on a second. Aha. Kitsch here can be considered as a process of mediation in which life itself is a medium, a vital process. My definition of mediation comes from Sarah Kemper and Joanna Zielinska's definition, which states that mediation is a key trope for understanding and articulating our being in and becoming with the technological world, our emergence and ways of interacting with it, as well as the acts and processes of temporality stabilizing the world into media agents, relations, and networks. It is a multiple entangled process of becoming. As such, Kemper and Zielinska point out that media cannot be externalized from its subjects. The subjects I examine in this paper are simultaneously actors and objects in their varying performances of and as mediation. While considering the historical debates on kitsch, which there are many, I hope to make a case for a shift in thinking of kitsch as trash or bad or imitation by providing metaphors that build off the possibility of kitsch being a positive and useful process. Moreover, the concepts of artifice, imitation, and the copy are reconsidered. The copy is an essential process in evolution and the emergence of novel forms by ways of mutation. Furthermore, in virtual digital culture, imitation and artifice are essential processes in image making and manipulation, gene editing, bioengineering, and so on. The distinction between what is natural and artificial is sometimes considered a false division and can be considered in relation to the many interlocking, embedded ways that nature and technology intersect in today's world. Again, referencing my linked affinity with Haraway, nature is a process of production whereby reproduction is a key actant in the generation of novel forms. The terms I use in this paper themselves perform the kitsch process by kitsching terms from science, philosophy, and aesthetic theory. By copying and reproducing them, I hope to contribute something new by way of offering what could be called theoretical mutations. Okay, where am I? Aha. So, to start, I'll go into a bit of the history of kitsch. So historically, kitsch is thought of as a way to describe objects and images that are facile, lowbrow, cheap imitations, etc. The term was first coined in the 19th century to refer to inexpensive souvenirs sold to tourists. It comes from the German verb verkitschen, meaning to make cheaply. In fact, kitsch is so much about cheap material objects that the word brings to mind kitschy figurines, snow globes, Van Gogh calendars, kittens, paintings of florals, and I could go on. Kitsch, in its historical definition, refers to a kind of overly material, saturated object. How much? Yet, here is a list of some of the many definitions that have come, all the different theorizations of kitsch. It has been described as one of the most bewildering and elusive categories of modern aesthetics: partial, temporary, paradoxical, mechanical, and operating by formulas. Kitsch is vicarious experience and faked sensations, a mixed, impure hybrid state. And the final quote basically says that everything is kitsch if we want it to be. So kitsch resists unanimity about what it is, what it does, what it can be. Because of kitsch's open and versatile nature, I find that kitsch is the perfect theoretical nomad, a floating signifier. In her essay, Kitsch is Dead, Long Live Kitsch, the production of hyperkitsch in Las Vegas, Clara Aratzabal puts forth the idea that, sorry, I got really disorganized here. If kitsch is here to stay, we need to explore its pedagogical, liberating, and redemptive potential. The blurring of the boundaries between the real and imagined has produced a new vocabulary aimed at capturing the elusive yet revolutionary change. Reality is no longer what it used to be. The boundaries of kitsch have expanded dramatically in our times, ranging from all forms of kitsch art to kitsch architecture and urbanism, from objects that we can possess to spaces we can inhabit. It is within this expansion of boundaries that I propose this theory of kitsch. Here's some kitsch. This is a kind of rough chart, which I'm referring to as the kitsch spectrum. I'm going to pass it up here, just for time's sake, because I want to show this. So the first process I will talk about is natural kitsch. So natural kitsch uses Darwin's theory of natural selection to theorize how kitsch as a process selects and reproduces characteristics of an organism. Natural selection is a process whereby the phenotype or observable characteristics of an organism are reproduced based on the natural preferences of its environment. Natural kitsch attempts to show how kitsch as a process selects and reproduces specific traits or characteristics. So here we go. How do I, where is there a mouse?
The touchpad on the...
Oh.
Cannot.
Perhaps I'll just speak. One example of the natural blah. So the first example is a parasite. This is the cordyceps fungus. Michel Serres points out that the French word parasite has three meanings. One is biological parasite, two social parasite, and three static or interference. It's the third meaning that I find most useful in understanding the kitsch process. Okay. It's not happening on the big screen.
It's not happening on the big screen.
Oh dear. Noise is productive and creative. This is a quote from Sarah's. Great. Noise is productive and creative. Noise, through its presence and absence, the intermittence of the signal, produces the new system. I'm just going to pause it 1 second. Okay. So to examine this, I look to this ant. The ant inhales a spore. I can't hear it. Well, let's just watch. The ant inhales the spore of the mushroom and becomes driven to climb up the tree. Perhaps you've seen this before. When the ant inhales the spore of this mushroom, its system is interrupted, and for the first time in its life, the ground-dwelling ant desires to climb upward. She climbs the nearest tree, and as she sits waiting, the mushroom begins to sprout out of her body, and she is transformed into the mushroom. Serres writes, the introduction of a parasite in the system immediately provokes a difference, a disequilibrium. Immediately, the system changes. The mushroom replicates itself by interrupting the ant's system. The spore can be thought of as the noise in the system, and it is this noise that produces something new out of the ant. It is this point at which the ant is neither the ant nor the mushroom that I'm interested in. This is the moment when the organism exists in a state of kitsch, no longer what it was, yet not what it will become. It is ant becoming mushroom. So my second example of natural kitsch is bodybuilding. So, I don't even know. Okay, here we go. Thank you. There. So bodybuilding, writes Kathy Acker, is about nothing but failure. As a series of controlled movements, the continuous counting of the same repetition, muscles are built by being broken down. The kitsch body is a body made from repetitions of targeted failure, from repeating. Gertrude Stein says, always repeating is all of living. Everything in a being is always repeating. In order to build the bodybuilder's body, in order to fail again, the builder must increase the weight reps or intensity in order to again come to failure. Repeating failure is one method, one process of the natural kitsch phenomenon. To exaggerate a feature, the kitsch process works by slowly breaking down its isolated target in order to shock it into growth. Oh no. Okay. The body of the bodybuilder exists in a state of kitsch, whereby she is always in a state of becoming, working herself up to failure and failure again. So I'll move on to post-natural kitsch. With the advent of synthetic biology, defined as the science of selectively altering the genes of organisms to make them do things that they wouldn't do in their original natural state, our relationship to the natural and the artificial is further complicated. Darwin's term of artificial selection refers to the process of breeding for desired traits, but in post-natural kitsch, I coined this term kitsch selection. So just as computers were universal machines, so biological organisms approached the condition of being universal constructors, in the sense that with appropriate changes to their genetic programming, they could be made to produce practically any imaginable artifact. Post-natural kitsch refers to this post-natural processes, such as the engineering of organisms. My example for this is this product called Mural. Mural is a bioplastic in which microbes genetically engineered to metabolize corn sugar produce plastic. The plastic is excreted from the microbe in small pellets that can be melted and molded to make everyday objects traditionally made with petrochemical plastics. These biologically altered organisms are programmable manufacturing systems, tiny biological factories. What interests me here is the reversal of the relationship of the organic and the inorganic. Here we have the non-organic modified microbe producing a bioplastic. The state of kitsch here is the moment when these microbes are filled with little plastic pellets. It is both simultaneously organic and non-organic. It is the perfect microbial cyborg. Great, I have another video, so it's gonna. Do I, how much time? Is that time? 2 minutes? I'm just gonna skip this section on cyborg aesthetics because I would like to propose the very last sort of thing I will say, which I'm sure you're, okay. So the rest of the theory starts to talk about aesthetic theories. One possible effect of this sort of kitsch theory is that it produces special affect or special affects. No, so many technical, my clicker. So this is all going to, all right. Should I touch this one? Well, here we go. I just want to show one last one. This one. All right, I'll end with a short quote and a small thing, and then I'll show you this crazy thing I made, and then it'll be it. So, conclusion, kitsch as feminist ally. The split and contradictory self is the one, this is a quote from Haraway. The split and contradictory self is the one who can interrogate positions and be accountable. The one who can construct and join rational conversations with fantastic imaginings that change history. Splitting, not being, is the privileged image for feminist epistemologies of scientific knowledge. Kitsch, in this theory, is a state of splitting, a mixed state, and therefore one such possible subject position for feminist epistemologies, one possible potential fantastic imagining for re-envisioning the life sciences, both past and future, one possible entry point in the articulation of aesthetics for post-human philosophy, a feminist kitsch coyote whose open-ended and malleable nature can be used as an ally for theorizing the feminist post-human. And this chart is essentially what I'm referring to as kitsch theory. It's all the terms that I use and think of when I'm writing, and then I've kitsched them. So Deleuze molar desire becomes molar kitsch, and so forth and so on. And that's, thank you.
Okay, and with that, we do have about 15 minutes. I'm sure they have, hopefully, yes, a mic that works. Questions for our panelists? Yes.
Thank you. I have a question for Matt Bean that perhaps if you can't answer directly, maybe you can point me to some literature. You had a chart there talking about different ways that biometrics are already being used, including in the welfare system. I'm from Canada, and I remember reading for the first time about the fact that biometrics is used in the welfare system, quite shocking. And then looking at your considerations for biometrics from Jane, how does it work in terms of when you're talking about two parties, one being the government and one being the potential welfare recipient, in terms of that idea of acceptance? I mean, obviously the welfare recipient has no
leverage,
no choice,
yeah.
Right? So if you can comment on that, that would be awesome. But if not, if there's literature on the biometrics in welfare systems, that'd be interesting. Thank you.
Sure. I would point you to that chart comes from Jane's paper. So it's Jane Hong and Picanti, 2000 Biometric Identification. They also have a book. Jane and Hong have a book out together. Actually, no, I'm sorry. It's Jane and Ross, Introduction to Biometrics, which is a little more recent, from 2008, which is a great resource for this as well. When you're talking about the ethical conundrum one has, and it's a power the struggle, right? When you have someone who's on welfare and they are having to submit to their submit to the removal of their data to be stored or obtained or processed, transmitted by a government entity in exchange for a government service. This is, well, I guess I have to say this is I'm an attorney. I'm also a practicing attorney, and I've been a practicing attorney for 10 years, and I spent several years working with low-income people in Texas who had similar situations. And do I feel that it's okay in terms of whether right or wrong? I'm going to say my moral code would say no. And there is a good examination of this, and I'm having a hard time trying to think of who the author was because I didn't get too far into the ethics on this. But I had a couple of sources. I did another paper on the ethics, and the sources are eluding me more on the power differences in the legal system and what that compels people to do. But from a practical standpoint, which I can answer a little more directly here, they don't really have a choice. And that's unfortunate, but that is the way it works. When you accept software, and obviously very different things, but if you go through, who here reads the end user license agreement that pops up every time you have the software? Now, I read it every time too, but that's my job. Do you have any particular, do you just like it to read it, or?
I'm just paranoid.
You're just paranoid? That's good, be paranoid. I read it because I write papers about that kind of stuff. I like to see what people sneak in. And most people don't, though. You are the only other person besides me who raised their hand. And if you say no to accepting that end-use license agreement, you do not get to use the software. The government works on the same sort of thing. There is an offer and an acceptance. It is a contractual relationship. Now, whether that should be the case is a separate discussion. And unfortunately, I don't have the literature handy. There is writing on it, and I do have some in my library. I'm sorry that I don't have it immediately off the top of my head.
Can I ask a follow-up question just on that really quickly? If you say yes and then you remove the software or you remove the app, are you still held to the original agreement of
To the
acceptance?
that's very good. In the United States, and I have to preface this in the United States, a revocation is effective as of the point of revocation. So you have accepted it for the duration of your use of the software, but any subsequent interaction could not take place. Now, of course, if you uninstall, a Twitter app, for example, I use Twitter when I've taught a class similar to this in the past. I use Twitter as an example because Twitter, if you go read their terms of service, and I encourage everyone to do this, they have the legalese, and then under it, they have what their lawyers wrote to be the plain language interpretation of what it means for you. And I can assure you my interpretation of their legalese is slightly different than the way they're presenting it. And so it's a good exercise to go see what you're really agreeing to. They often make you agree to a blanket license to use your information however they see fit with no royalties, license in perpetuity. That's a standard license agreement if you read any of this stuff. And so you're giving away your information. If you give away, and you cannot get that back. Once you revoke it, anything you did during the time you accepted it is still held to the license during the terms of the acceptance. Does that make sense? Did I explain that clearly? Okay. Yeah.
So I have a question for Chris about the zombie ants, and thinking about Kitsch, it seems like the mushroom spores sort of make the ants like more kind of like reflective of their natural environment, which is what, I don't know, when you were going through examples of Kitsch and like the tourist things, it seems like all the tourist sort of commodities and stuff like reflect their habitat or environment in such a way. And I was wondering if you could speak more about how these zombie ants, like if the infection of their spores, like if the reason that you're considering that Kitsch is mostly due to it's like the natural environment sort of infecting them and making it a representation more so of their natural environment, or what your thoughts about that were, if you could just talk more about it.
a representation of its natural environment. I'm really just interested in the state where it's sort of in a mixed state, where it's neither one thing or the other thing, but it's in a process of becoming something else that it wasn't. So I don't know how to really speak to its environment. I guess I'm not considering the environment of the thing. I'm considering sort of the internal process of what's happening within the thing.
So basically, if the ant's forms changed in some way, and like as you said, it's like becoming, and it's no longer an ant, it's sort of a combination of like this parasite and an ant. That's like what pitch is in this sense.
Oh dear. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. I hope that. Yeah. So that's what I was considering. That's what I'm considering kitsch to be, this mixed state, this process where you're neither one thing but you're the other, or you're driven by something in a way. And there's this lovely metaphor I've come across with this parasite specifically that says like you've inhaled the spore as sort of a metaphor of desire. You've inhaled the spore. You're driven to do something. Why does the ant climb up the tree? Because it's inhaled the spore. I don't know if that answers your question.
I was interested in, I'm curious to see what you think of the difference between kitsch and metamorphosis. I mean, have you thought about those two words together?
Kitsch metamorphosis. As proposing this as a term, or as proposing it is, because I guess what I am thinking of is kitsch is a metamorphosis. I guess that's what I haven't used the word metamorphosis, or really thought about its lineage. I'm thinking about, I guess that implies transformation, and what I've been mostly curious by is reproduction and replication and regeneration, specifically related to virtual digital culture and the way that we copy things. And so my curiosity was really sparked in making copies of my paintings and then repainting them and then copying those. And so transformation hasn't occurred to me so much as like the possibility of creating something new by doing something over and over. And so I look to nature to see where that happens.
When you were talking about welfare, are you just talking about information like social security numbers? Or are you talking about fingerprints and blood samples to test for drugs? What were you referring to?
What I was responding to your question. If you could, what your specific was. I'm forgetting because you said it was Canada. But,
well, I'm from Canada,
right.
so I'm not familiar
Okay.
with
Yeah.
the use of biometrics with
Yes.
welfare recipients. I have heard of blood testing, but I'm assuming it's
Not typically, no. Yeah, typically, if you enter the system, we're looking at fingerprints and whatnot.
that I assume is to prove you're the person who should be receiving that welfare check, say.
That's the purpose of the government's use for fingerprint is identification. The main use of biometrics in governmental use are identification rather than authentication. So when we're talking about it on your phone, that's authentication, to authenticate your identity, whereas the government is identifying you as the person you are claiming to be. So yes, that would generally be the same purpose.
I think initially I read that they were doing blood tests of people claiming to have children to prove that their children were their children. Is that something that does happen?
I can't speak to that. I do not know offhand. I wouldn't be surprised if it was, but I can't say that it has, so I don't know.
It looks like we are out of questions. There are 5 minutes left, so if you want to come up and speak to them directly, please feel free. And I want to thank again Matt, Chris, and Patrick for your thought-provoking presentations. And thank you all for being here. So, thank you.
Always Rocky.
Is it technology that has influenced their
You
behavior?
know that's sort of the jinx, right?
Yes, of course.
Use your place and
Influx.
yeah.
I have the problem with, you know, I've seen everyone has their red markers and like their comments
Oh, I
are
was just like,
scattered.
he changed her own. Well, is there ways that that sugar might have helped in the DNA find her behavior? I just thought that was interesting, the acceptance, because obviously, you know, you'd be talking about the level of the government. Do they think this is a visible program, you know, financially?
They give you agreement, and like my whole instinct, I want to do the L6 case and just
Nobody has time for it.
nobody never wins it. But when you're looking at a contract, so there has to be an offer, an acceptance, and you have to have receipt. There has to be an exchange, otherwise it's not legal.
Right.
And if smart, you can do use cases and currencies, which is kind of interesting. So like if I say I'm going to give you $100,000, sweet, and then you try to sue me later and I don't give it, you didn't offer me anything in return.
Okay.
No consideration, not
Come
part
on.
of the contract. However, if you want to
Yeah, let's do
like
it.
somehow manage to get a loan for a house on your basis,
Is this the
then you
universities?
have acted
Yeah.
in furtherance
So
of that on
let's get
reliance
this
of the
thing
information.
up.
Then you have grounds.
Right.
Which is kind of weird. And so the
I
government
think
works with their
we're all
consideration.
set
They
to
need
go.
something in return
Everything's,
for
yeah,
what
well,
they
I think
do.
he had the,
For it to
yeah,
be
there it is. So
reflected in
this
their
comes
case,
in, is that right? That's
electronic
correct.
services.
I thought he had a black
Okay.
one.
Thanks.
Oh, you're right. He had it
Yeah, let me
connected.
let me
Go
grab
ahead.
my laptop
Oh,
out
yeah,
from under here
sorry.
and get out of your way.
Okay.
Too much junk up here, I'm
Okay.
sorry.
There we go. Let's just see here. He had, yeah, he had this dongle. There it is. So this goes right there. I think the other way around. Yes. Yeah. There we go. Okay. And then the sound. Oh, you need, that's right. Yeah, I have the. Let me see if I can find this. Here it is. There it is. Oh, you're here to help him.
No, just to have name tags.
Is there tech support?
I can ask Erica.
Yeah, I think, he ran through this with me before, so let's see if I can just make it play at the right level. Okay?
Oh, David's coming.
Here he comes. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so you're good. All right.
Sure.
Yeah.
Just confirming, like Instagram talk at this point.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Hi.
Oh, yeah. Sign in first. Yeah, okay.
You have a chance to figure out if Parker's only computer being used or
No, I think the guy after me, he's got a Mac,
Okay.
and I don't know where he is, but
Shouldn't be a problem. You should just plug into
just
the
plug in there.
same
That's all.
same
Yeah, that's
one
all
on the
he'll
back
need.
there.
I don't think he doesn't have the need for sound.
Okay.
So,
Sounds like your sound worked.
I think so. Let's let me open this.
Oh, really?
Master Raw.
I tested the green lines. Actually, went through the whole process. Dry run, apt code implemented.
I just want to check the volume one more time, okay? Okay. Oh, I got to get into the slideshow. Consummation.
Here we
Oh
are.
my God. Make sure that video plays through. I'm going to. Sounds all right. That's all.
Good night, Kathy. See you tomorrow.
Good night, darling.
That's good.
Take care of that throat.
Yeah,
You're a big singing star now, remember?
that's great.
This California dew was just...
So, eighth out of here. Well, and go back to the beginning. Good to
Are you
go.
the first presenter?
I am.
Awesome.
So,
Then I believe there's someone on Blue Jeans after you.
yeah,
So
okay.
make sure that's
Oh, no. Oh, is there? No, no, actually, Jer said someone's coming in on blue jeans. Just to introduce us. I don't know what he's doing. So you have to ask him. Okay. Does that mean? Maybe he's introducing. Yeah. No problem. Leave it all plugged in. I got the control. Okay. So I'm good to go with this. I believe so. Yeah. So all you need to do is plug that in there, right? Yep. There you go. I had a fantastic conversation about protocells with, and I'm wondering
Hi.
Hey there, Julia.
Hey.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, awesome. I might turn you up a little bit, but I think should be good. Are you sharing your screen at all?
I don't think so.
Okay, all right. You should be okay then.
Okay, great.
Professor Capra joining us. Short, open discussion.
Hey, Julia, if you're okay with this, we're just gonna leave you on since you're the very first person to talk. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Or we'll blank the screen on our end, but you don't need to do anything.
Okay, just let me know when I
Okay.
should do something.
We will.
Okay, thanks.
And then are they good with their?
All right, again, explain the scenes for future possibilities. Please. Is there water you can get? I'm sure I can find one somewhere. Yeah, go ahead and grab some.
Hi, are you Mark?
I'm gonna.
Okay. So Mark's bot laptop is plugged in.
Happy to help out. But let me show you real quick.
Yeah, I was just looking at it.
It's the same cord. So literally, plug it in. You don't have audio.
That's it. Okay.
I'll be in the booth watching. So
Okay. Is there a mic?
but that'll be randomly scanned. Can swap around.
So it's their way of trying to get it next week. Okay. So it's a very specific about you, and then she's got a short paragraph that you emailed her. So hopefully you get her going. Thanks, Mark. Okay, hi Julia, how are you?
Hi. Good, how are you?
You see me right here?
Yeah.
Okay, just want to say thank you very much. Brooke Mueller sends his best regards. So, just so that we're clear, we're going to keep it short. And I think you've got a good, how long do you think you'll be?
I haven't timed it, but a minute and a half.
2 minutes, yeah, 2 minutes would be great. So some introductory notes about the EDC.
Yeah.
And then introduction of Professor Johnson.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Sure.
Awesome. Okay, so that's it. Thank you. They're hosting the major people launch for design center.
Check, check. Check 1, 2.
Check. Okay, we will be commencing in just about 1 minute. So we're just waiting for some last folks to be making it into the room, and thank you for your patience. All right. Hi everyone. Like to introduce, coming here from Eugene, Oregon, the director of the Holistic Options for Planet Earth Sustainability Conference, the HOPES Conference that will be happening next week at the University of Oregon. And here to introduce Mark Johnson is Julia Frost. Julia, take it away.
Thanks, Jer. Hi, everyone up in Portland. As Jer said, I'm an architecture student at University of Oregon, And we're actually putting on pretty similar events this year, Jerry and I, or at least events that we think would have a similar audience. So as you said, I'm putting on the Hopes Conference, which we do yearly at the School of Architecture and Allied Arts in Eugene. So if anyone's able to make it down to Eugene next week, it's from Thursday to Saturday. We're talking about displacement this year, which sort of in the context of how designers can and should address changes in human and non-human populations, environments, laws, and paradigms. So if anyone's interested in that topic and is able to be in Eugene, we'd love to see you. We have a website, hopes.uoregon.edu, so please check it out. So back to the conference here, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Mark Johnson, participating faculty in the Environmental Studies program, whose research engages an embodied approach, how organisms are always in ongoing interaction with their environments. Professor Johnson is a Philip H. Knight Professor of Liberal Arts and Sciences in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Oregon. His monographs include Morality for Humans and The Meaning of the Body. In October 2017, Johnson's first of a 2-volume anthology will be released, Embodied Mind, Meaning, and Reason, How Our Bodies Give Rise to Understanding. He is the author of numerous articles and book chapters on a broad range of topics, including aesthetics, ethical naturalism, embodied cognition, and American pragmatist philosophy. Professor Johnson's talk is entitled An Embodied Aesthetics and Ethics of Life. Please help me in welcoming Professor Johnson.
Thank you. I want to read you an email I got this morning. It says, "Dear gentlemen," oh, open this mic. It's on. It's green. Yeah, just talk into it then, huh? Yeah. This is, "Dear gentlemen," he's referring to Lakoff, George Lakoff and me. "I'm writing this mail to let you know that your text, Metaphors We Live By, is really something useless. Some content is acceptable, but for the most part, it is pure shit. You have only helped cut down trees to produce your text. Put it online for free. At least you will have the advantage of saving the forest. Shame on you for a job so much ugly and lacking scientific value." So that'll keep you humble. I don't know what I did wrong. I'll buy back his copy of Metaphors We Live By. We human beings are creatures of the flesh. Our animate bodies, engaging our surroundings through our strivings, our frustrations, and our satisfactions, generate all the meaning of which we are capable. We can only experience what our bodies, brains, and environments allow us to experience. We can only think what our bodies, brains, and environments allow us to think. And we can only imagine what our bodies, brains, and environments allow us to imagine. Consequently, everything we experience, understand, feel, think, and do arises from the ongoing interactions of our bodies with their changing environments. The quality and character of these interactive processes give rise to the only meaning and values available to us, defining who and what we are. So, if you want to understand how human meaning and value